Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you to everyone for taking time to be here with us today. I'm very excited to dig into this conversation. So, to frame us up a little before I turn to Josh and Ben, we all know there have been efforts for years, decades, centuries even, to blame inequality on technology. But we believe that this diverts attention from the root cause of why workers might lose out in times of technological change. In our view, that's really excess employer power. And for the last, 40 years, my colleagues and researchers at EPI have focused on these issues. They have looked at the available data and they have poked holes in a lot of the conventional wisdom that technology just drives inequality and that technological change just means we have to accept the natural response that some people will be left behind in the new economy that emerges on the other side. Many times it's been proponents of technology and change pushed by technology who have advanced this argument that this is just an inevitable outcome, that there's an ever smaller group of winners and a growing group of losers. But we also see today that many of those who are also skeptical of new technologies are also taking up this call. People who are concerned about outcomes for workers, for society, for the planet, are looking at developments in AI technology as drivers of potential mass job loss, displacement, job quality degradation, and more. And understandably, people are looking for policy solutions. But here at EPI, we think it's important to make sure that arguments about how we should address these concerns don't repeat past mistakes and don't fall into the trap of assuming that we can identify the perfect tech regulation to protect workers. So my colleagues, Josh and Ben, who have thought about this a lot, are here to discuss today why they still think the best AI policy to protect workers is to enact many of the things that workers have already been organizing around for decades: a voice on the job, having good jobs available, and making sure that there's a strong social safety net. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh first and ask, Josh, could you just explain the kind of EPI historical view on tech and the economy, and why is it important to be clear about whether or not we think tech is the culprit for the problems workers are facing or something else?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll try to go quickly because you did a great setup on it. But I'll say that the biggest problem U.S. workers have faced in recent decades has been too slow wage growth for like the bottom 80% of the workforce and the resulting increase in inequality. And this poor wage performance all really started in the late 1970s, accelerated into the 80s and 90s, and the early conventional wisdom about this inequality, particularly among economists, was that labor markets were generally competitive and efficient, and it was must have been then deep structural market forces, things that shifted the relative demand and supply for different types of workers, things like technology, the introduction of personal computers, the pace of educational attainment. That must be what drove labor market outcomes. The conventional wisdom basically said that because labor markets were competitive and efficient, any institution or policy like minimum wages or unions, they might affect some small sliver of workers, they might help them, but they would only do it by introducing their own sort of costly distortions that were bad for other workers. And since they just could not be a key reason why inequality was stable in the 30 years after World War II and couldn't be a big part of policy going forward. And EPI was basically created to cast a really ruthlessly data-centric eye on this conventional wisdom. And one of its first and most important, I think, hits on it was leading a wave of work that really started poking big holes, like you said, in the story that it was technology that was a big driver in inequality. And instead, our view was that labor markets are fundamentally tilted towards employers and give them excess power. And so things like unions and minimum wages actually solve a distortion at the same time as they are giving workers some power. And that's the real story of inequality, taking away those institutions that bolstered workers' bargaining power and actually made the labor market efficient. Um, I think besides the fact that lots of economists now agree with us now, I wouldn't say all of them, but it's a much more mainstream argument than it used to be. And also, this whole debate shed a light on how inequality was created by political decisions. The story that inequality was driven by the march of technology interacting with competitive and efficient labor markets is one where inequality is sad, but there's just not that much to be done and nobody is to blame. I think that's a very convenient story for the powerful who actually engineered the policy changes and benefited from the rise in inequality. And so pointing out this convenient story doesn't actually explain the world was a real accomplishment for EPI. And I think it's why we find the current discourse around AI a little bit deflating. I think the world did a lot of useful learning and not allowing the rich and powerful to claim that inequality was just a sad byproduct of inevitable technological progress. I think we learned that technology does not lead inevitably to higher inequality or disempowered workers. Those outcomes are driven by policy choices in a broader institutional context. But for some reason, Lots of the AI debate today has sort of slipped back into the technological determinism story that technology will, by its very nature, leave people worse off. We think whether or not US workers thrive in an era of AI remains mostly a policy decision. And the vast majority of policy decisions that will determine this have to do with the level of minimum wages, the determination of macro policymakers to sustain full employment, the effectiveness of labor law, and allowing workers to unionize and bargain collectively, and how robust the US welfare state becomes. And so there are some more specific policy decisions and regulations that the rise of AI is going to force on us. But the big picture of how much typical US workers participate in growth going forward is going to be mostly about these broader policies.
Thanks for that, Josh. And I think maybe turning to your point about the current discourse on AI, let's talk about that a little bit. What is your alarm level on AI and its potential labor market effects? And I'll, to set parameters for the conversation we're having today, we're talking about AI in the economy, workers, the labor market, those concerns specifically. What's your alarm level on that? I think I'll turn to Ben first.
I think our alarm level is a little lower than many others in the AI debate. It's something we're definitely monitoring closely, but the reason why our alarm level is lower is that for now, we think of AI as one more technological shock hitting the US economy, and we're hit by those all the time. Technology, it is very important for determining the pace of overall economic growth, but like Josh was talking about, the distribution of this growth, who gets what, how equal or unequal things are, that's really about policies and institutions. And specifically, the main relevant policies for the labor market are the things that Josh mentioned. Can workers join unions? Do policymakers prioritize keeping unemployment as low as possible? Are minimum wages strong? How robust and protective is our welfare state? How progressive and comprehensive is our tax system? And technology hasn't really been a big driver of bad trends there, and we expect the same of AI. That being said, people are genuinely unsettled about AI, and it's not unjustified. The US has a very poor track record on those policies and institutions we mentioned to distribute growth more equitably. So when people hear about a new technological wave that may make a few people extremely rich, but at the same time threaten their livelihoods, they're not wrong to be worried. American institutions could let that happen, and in fact, they've been letting that happen for decades. For example, in any normal year in the US, there are over 20 million layoffs, and each one of those introduces a lot of stress into families' lives. A lot of that is because nowhere near enough of those layoffs trigger useful and generous social protections like unemployment insurance that's easy to access and enough to live on, and that gives workers the leverage to find another job that pays well and fulfills their career goals. The effects of AI could pile on top of that if AI sharply shifts the kinds of occupations in demand in the economy. But that's really less a problem about AI or some new technology, and it's more a problem about our threadbare unemployment benefit system. So that is actually related to my main worry about AI, that we're going to miss the forest for the trees. The economy is softening. Unemployment crept up last year. Now we have the Iran war price shock that's going to reduce real wages and consumption. There is a lot on people's plates, and AI is another stressor. And it's a stressor connected to really genuinely frightening things outside of the labor market, like the use of AI and law enforcement, surveillance, consumer privacy, deepfakes being used to confuse or harass people. And finally, the main proponents of this technology are actively stoking those fears by hyping ideas of economic insecurity and suggesting just very narrow guardrails, highly specific to AI. Some of these concerns are very real, but when we're talking about the labor market, instead, we should absolutely all be fighting constantly to change the rules of the game in unbalanced labor markets, building out a more protective set of universal social insurance and income support policies. We should be doing this regardless of the state of play at AI. AI might ramp up the need to strengthen all of this and to keep inequality from rising further, but it might not really, and no one is really sure either way. A lot of folks think that the attention and focus on AI is helping this broader fight. That would be great, but let's make sure that we're really using AI concerns as a wedge to get broader reforms. Personally, I don't really see that. And instead, I'll see a lot of demand for new and very tailored AI policies. And I worry that's a very bad detour. And in fact, a gift to the powerful among us who really like today's status quo, where institutions for ensuring broadly shared prosperity are weak. Sam Altman or any other tech industry titan would love it if everybody spent a lot of time speculating wildly about AI and designing policies very tailored to AI that'll be invariably easy to game. They're very excited to push the narrative of AI taking over all jobs because that simply serves to terrify workers, make them scared about their jobs, and willing to preemptively accept poor pay and working conditions. And other employers are riding that bandwagon, making layoffs that are arguably due to fewer customers or rising tariffs or other reasons, but they're claiming those layoffs are due to AI. What unscrupulous employers like them do not want is all of us focused on making it easier to unionize, having a large expansion of the unemployment benefits system, or having stronger progressive taxation that funds universal health insurance. These are exactly the policies that will rebalance toward workers in general and also in the age of AI. Now, if labor market data starts suggesting this new set of developments as having broad and negative impacts, I and others at EPI will certainly change our minds about the alarm level. AI is new, it's important, it deserves serious attention. But right now, the most effective set of policies to help low and middle income families in this changing world are the kind of no regrets policy solutions that we already need to reduce inequality and rebalance power toward workers.
Thanks for that, Ben. And can we actually get right into that last point there, the data? What do we know right now about how AI is affecting the economy that we can kind of validate with data?
You want to take that one, Ben?
Yeah, so sorry about that. My mic is okay. So right. So I think it's when we're thinking about how AI is affecting the economy right now, it's helpful to define a few terms, create some categories. The three really big questions are what is the short run macroeconomic effect of big AI related spending that's hitting the economy in recent years? Is it true that the US economy would be in a recession without these effects? Does that mean we should really be happy about those spending? Basically, how much is AI driving the economy versus everything else? The second set of questions is how much will AI boost economy-wide productivity in the coming years? Productivity, what that means is that how much income or output is generated for a given hour of work in the US economy. How fast productivity will rise is one of the most important questions about any economy at any point in time, and the extra productivity boost made possible by AI adoption is a key issue. The third set of questions is, will AI destroy jobs? Will it destroy them on net? Will it lead to an unusually fast pace of churn where many jobs disappear, but they're replaced by other jobs? Or will it destroy jobs on net for particular kinds of workers or particular types of workers? Do we think those workers will struggle relative to others finding alternative employment somewhere else in the economy? Only on that first question, what is the short run macro effect associated with AI related spending? Only that first question is one that we can be super confident about right now. Answers about AI's effect on productivity or the mix of employment that it might lead to are very speculative.
So could we start maybe with the short run macroeconomic info first, given that that's what you feel most confident in? And maybe Josh, I'll turn to you for that.
Yeah. I would say, as we said, this one is actually a gift because it's kind of straightforward and there's actually data we can measure. I'd say there are two main spending flows in the economy right now associated with the race by AI companies to become kind of the first to mass market. The first is just tangible business investment. Lots of firms hoping to be in the first wave of companies as AI products are adopted. This means they're investing a lot today in data centers, servers, racks, research. So this wave of AI-related spending, we're going to call it CapEx for capital expenditures. It's spurring demand for components, construction materials, labor, people. The other big spending flow is related to the big increase in the market valuation of AI-related companies, which has driven a stock market boom in recent years. Each year, some bit of consumption spending in the economy is financed out of wealth. General estimate is that a dollar increase in wealth leads to about 2 cents in additional consumption spending. So to actually measure the AI effect on CapEx, I think the safest thing you can do with the macro data we have available, you just take categories of business investment that the AI build out is concentrated in, data centers, information processing equipment, software, R&D spending, and you see if there's a big pickup in these sectors' contribution to overall growth recently. And there is. And we're going to call this excess CapEx contribution of about 0.35% of GDP. Basically, that's how much we are seeing an abnormal growth in those sectors where you'd expect to see that sort of AI spend. Maybe a little less if you account for the fact that lots of the equipment is likely imported, which does not actually add to US GDP. For the consumption stock market effect, you look at today's PE ratio for the stock market, the price to earnings ratio. It's a measure of how expensive it is to buy a dollar's worth of earnings in the stock market. And it turns out it's really expensive relative to the historical past. It's more expensive than any period in history, except for the late 1990s, 2000 stock market, which was just an unambiguous bubble, which saw a very large correction. If you're old like me, you remember that that bubble was also driven by wild enthusiasm about tech. And so today's PE ratio is close to 40. Say it moves to a more normal number pegged to fundamentals of around 30. It's a 25% decline. That would imply a reduction in consumption spending because of lower wealth of about $200 billion. That's right around 0.65% of GDP. Combine those two effects, you're about 1% of GDP. Growth for 2025 was just under 2%. So it's pretty safe to say that something like half of all growth in the past year in the US economy really was being propelled by this sort of AI build out.
So if half of all growth in 2025 roughly was from AI related spending, is that good or not?
I would say, some growth is better than no growth for sure. And I do think the AI related spending picking up steam in 2025 was a very lucky kind of macroeconomic card drawn by the Trump administration. I think lots of their policy choices over this year slowed growth in lots of other areas. And this would have led to a more pronounced labor market deterioration had the AI related spending not filled in some of that. And just, one example we have noted, we're far from the only ones, that lots of the Trump administration agenda in 2025 would in normal times have been seen as pretty bad for business investment. Their tariff policy was really extreme and chaotic. Their mass deportation policy is likely to have really negative effects on both the labor supply and customer base of very specific industries. They've locked in big increases in the deficit with their taxing and spending mega bill. They've sort of messed with the Fed's independence, which has probably pushed up interest rates a bit. All this should have been bad for investment. And yet AI related investment was really strong simply because the big AI race was kicked off in the early 2020s. And I'll just say one thing, it's a fun data center growth was actually faster in 2023 and 2024 than 2025, but it's a bigger base now. But the AI race was not started by anything the Trump administration did. It really was just a macroeconomic tailwind they inherited. But if we look at non-AI related investment, business investment, and that's more than half of business investment still, and you look how it did in 2025, and it did terribly. It contracted over the year. And so I would say the AI related spending surge has papered over some other weaknesses generated by policy. That said, it's a narrow and fragile base of growth going forward. Like a genuinely healthy economy should be able to generate enough demand to keep unemployment low without a stock market bubble. And both the stock market valuations and the determination to keep spending a ton of money on data centers and other capex relies on companies and investors thinking that the profits at the end are going to justify it. As more information about fundamentals trickles in, you never know what's going to be the thing that makes a couple of the big spenders finally decide to stop the capex and or deflates the stock market bubble. So I think that 1% contribution to GDP growth could go away pretty quickly with just a domino or two being kicked away. One obvious, destabilizer to all these profit expectations is the Iran conflict, a world where US customers are really pinched because of high gas prices and companies seeing revenue dry up as customers tap out. That's not a world where AI companies are going to be incredibly profitable. So it's good that we had the growth from AI related spending, in the short run. It is growth that could go away very quickly, and that's worrisome. And the rest of the economy is not doing that great.
Right. That's really helpful context on how it fits into kind of the broader narratives of like fragility in the current economy. I think related to that, and I'll turn to Ben for this one, where does this wave of AI related spending fit into other technological changes in history that we have data on? Like, is it very economically significant in comparison to those, or where does it stack up?
Yes, it's certainly a large burst of spending, very significant, but it is not the most significant burst of technology spending that the US has ever seen. Um, we can measure this, like Josh was talking about, and today's contribution from technological related capital expenditures is very large, but it's so far dwarfed by the late 1990s when this contribution was about twice as large relative to the size of the economy. The late 1990s saw a huge investment boom in wiring up offices and businesses for the internet. Now, that spending was associated with a stock market bubble, but it was a larger stock market bubble, as Josh talked about, when there were higher profits to earnings ratio as a result of that internet boom. And the concentration of the stock market boom in the 1990s in the specific technology sector was actually greater then than it is today. Now, the boost to productivity growth given by that internet boom in the mid 1990s through the mid 2000s was very large. Basically, the economy was about 15% larger at the end of that decade than what you would have guessed had there not been any internet boom. And that's a very big deal, but it's also basically on the high end of most of the macro based estimates on how much AI could boost productivity growth over the next decade. And those are potential or kind of speculative gains of AI compared to the actually achieved productivity gains of the real internet boom that we experienced. The internet had a very large, a much larger effect on the economy than AI has had so far, and perhaps even a larger effect on productivity than serious projections of the potential effects of AI. And so while it's hard to remember, the internet was a huge economic development at the time. And frankly, it was a huge success story that did improve our average standard of living.
Um, that's really helpful context. Maybe getting off of the stuff that we know and going more into that speculative side. AI and jobs. How should people organize? How should we organize our thoughts about AI and jobs in the future?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question with a bunch of angles. I'll say a couple things. One, like the short answer is that mass unemployment driven by AI seems highly unlikely. I would say there will be job displacement. It's a technological change that's going to cause some job displacement. The rate of it and its effect on wages and employment of big groups of workers remains really unknown and speculative. I think some preliminary evidence on these issues is being really overhyped. So just in turn, people often raise the specter of AI causing just mass unemployment, making human labor, totally unnecessary. It's really hard to tell a convincing economic story of how that happens. I think the loose argument seems to be that AI will make some small sliver of people so productive that all demand in the economy can be satisfied with very little labor. It's very hard to make that story make logical sense as a matter of macroeconomics, but I'm largely going to pass on that for now. I'll just say historically, it is unambiguous that the things that trigger recessions and really big spikes in unemployment have never been productivity increases. Instead, it's the collapse in demand that does this, spending by households, businesses, and governments. And in fact, during business cycles when productivity runs fast, even like in the late 1990s that were Ben just mentioned, you see lower, not higher unemployment rates. But that's, mass unemployment. More realistically, a world where AI displaces a good share of labor in some set of occupations, and the workers that are displaced spend some period of time trying to find other jobs to land in throughout the economy and face real distress. I mean, that seems very likely. And if the sectors that are not exposed to AI that can expand as AI leads to productivity gains in the exposed sectors just has a different mix of workers than the shrinking occupations, this can lead to some labor market sort of disequilibrium that's going to hurt some workers, to put that simply. And obviously, if AI takes the jobs of lots of coders, coder wages are obviously going to fall. We have no idea how widespread this displacement will be, or even what the rough patterns might end up being. But we know at least some of it will happen, and it's going to cause a lot of unaddressed suffering because that's the story of US economic history. The anxiety of constantly shifting labor markets and how they buffet workers is why I think US workers would really like more protection and more help navigating all this. I'd say the last big episode like this was likely the really big increase in international trade and trade deficits and the big push of workers out of manufacturing in the 2000s. Many of those workers took a long time to find new jobs. Many of the new jobs didn't pay as much. Lots of social dysfunction resulted. Lots of communities were damaged. If AI related displacement leads to a shock like this in an economy with only very weak institutions for blunting the suffering caused by labor market dislocation, it would be really bad for human welfare. We should do something about this. We've never been a country that helps workers with big transitions like this. The policies that help are those that support unions to increase the supply of alternate jobs that are good, policies to provide full employment so overall demand for workers is strong, and policies that make for a more protective welfare state, providing UI, delinking healthcare from specific jobs. Um, these are precisely the most important changes we can make to help workers thrive in an age of AI. And if AI concerns can be used as a flashlight to focus attention and vision on these long running problems, that'd be a real win. I'd say one last note. If we attempt to tailor assistance, though, only to those sort of displaced by AI or something like that, very little relief will be delivered. And that's not even because necessarily I'm saying the AI shock will be small. It's just once you make policy aid contingent on whether or not lawyers will declare whether or not your distress is caused by AI or not by AI, I'm going to say that policy aid has failed. We should instead make protection broad and universal for any worker suffering this kind of dislocation, regardless of what people argue actually caused it. I think we see this in the trade debate. Nobody thinks trade adjustment assistance was anywhere near protective enough for workers in the 2000s, and not even for workers specifically in trade exposed sectors.
Yeah, so thinking more about those workers in the most exposed sectors, like how AI might replace or impact them and the resulting kind of changes in the labor market, what do we know about what's happened on that job destruction scale so far? So you mentioned the example of coders. In particular, there's been a lot of attention given to what's happening with young workers, particularly young college graduates seeking their first entry level white collar jobs, what's happening to tech jobs and programming, other than obviously the very, real and anecdotal evidence that folks have talked about having these experiences or, specific very large employers like Amazon or, laying off large swaths of their own workforce, allegedly for AI reasons. What do we know about that in terms of the economic data?
Right. So this question, how many jobs has AI destroyed? Or, the next question, how many jobs will AI destroy? That's definitely the most asked question or set of questions. As for the future, the short answer is no one knows. But here are some things we can say about what's happened so far. One way economists are trying to answer this question is by constructing basically these measures of AI exposure or AI usage by occupation, and then comparing these highly AI exposed occupations or AI using occupations to occupations that are not as exposed or not using that AI using as much AI. We're still in the very early stages of this, so there's not a lot of evidence to hang on to. For one, the AI exposure and AI usage, they're obviously very correlated, but they don't always agree. Coders and computer scientists are measured as very exposed, and also their usage rates are totally off the charts high. But a lot of office and administrative staff are also very highly exposed to AI in principle, but their usage rates are much lower. Now, some studies find AI exposed or AI using occupations have had slower growth. Some have found that young workers in those occupations have shrunk, but other studies have found no effect or that these trends were already happening prior to the rollout of a lot of AI in workplaces. Recent research, for example, from economists at the Federal Reserve found no reduction in job postings for industries or firms that had higher level of AI adoption. So the evidence here is very mixed. Moreover, a lot of what's happening in the tech sector is related to an extraordinary hiring boom that the sector had after 2019. The share of workers in tech industries rose sharply from 2019 into 2023, but then it's dropped a bit. Maybe that's related to AI, but it's also something we would expect based on a bit of normalization in that sector anyway, especially if it overhired during those years. In terms of job churn, in terms of layoff and new hiring as the companies adjust to AI, job churn in the US economy is really at historic lows. If you squint at the data, maybe there is something there, but it's very mixed. For example, in the so-called information sector, which includes some, but not really all technologically related firms and also some media, looking at the information sector, you do see in recent months an increase in layoffs, but an increase in hiring. So there might be some increase in churn happening there. But then when you look at professional and business services, where there are a lot of office jobs that are highly exposed to AI, there just isn't much churn to speak of. So far, I'd say it's all very fuzzy, but I do think it's important to say that the burden of proof here lies on folks who want to claim AI has already made huge inroads into changing the structure of the labor market. And so far, this burden of proof hasn't come close to being met. Another example that comes up that you mentioned is that there's this often repeated claim that young college graduates are already seeing their career trajectories hampered by AI. And the pieces of evidence that people tend to put forward here are one, there's very low hiring rates, and then two, there's a higher relative unemployment rate for college grads. But I think that really overreads the data that we have on that group of workers. So first, the overall labor market is cooling. That's the fact. And young college graduates are indeed having a harder time getting jobs. There has been a big decline in hiring, but the industries that have seen more hiring since 2023 are in information and finance, which are supposed to be very heavy AI heavy industries, but they're doing more hiring. And the industries that haven't increased their hiring are the industries where you would expect less AI involvement, like hotels, restaurants, manufacturing, construction. That doesn't really fit the pattern you would expect if AI is the main difficulty for young workers trying to get hired. Some companies are also definitely claiming that they're making layoffs due to AI, and workers are being told that's the reason they're being let go. But layoffs in aggregate are still at low levels, and companies have a lot of incentive to claim that they're laying off workers or reducing hiring because of AI, rather than because of weak consumer demand, mismanagement, higher input prices due to tariffs or fuel costs, all the other things that would cause a business to shrink operations. But it's a lot more attractive to investors and shareholders to avoid mentioning those things and instead focus on AI. In terms of there being a higher relative unemployment rate for college grads, that's true. But that's mostly because there's been an increase in labor force participation for that group. That is not actually a bad thing. More of those workers are deciding to look for a job rather than not participate in the labor market at all. And that has been the main driver of mechanically increasing the unemployment rate for that group. Now, when you focus on employment rates, the share of college grads who actually have jobs, who are working at jobs, there has been a decline, but mostly that happened in 2024, and that decline has slowed a little bit since. But crucially, that's for young college grads. Crucially, young people without college degrees that don't have college degrees, they have seen a similar or sharper drop in employment. And that's crucial because AI is more likely to be affecting the kinds of office jobs that workers with college degrees would take rather than those without college degrees. That suggests AI is not the most likely culprit, making the labor market more difficult for young workers. Now, AI is going to be implemented in many workplaces in the coming decades, and the tasks that it automates are going to be widespread enough that it will cause some job displacement. The scale and pace of this displacement and the scale and pace of job creation spurred by AI, like Josh said, is very uncertain. Some real AI optimists among the economic forecasters, like the macroeconomic team at Goldman Sachs, think that AI displacement will come a bit quicker than any countervailing job creation. And what that means is that they see AI implementation over the next 3 years raising the unemployment rate by up to 0.5 percentage point. That is definitely a big deal, but it's also something we can mostly manage with straightforward policy solutions like a more humane and generous unemployment benefit system.
Thanks for that, Ben. I think that's actually a good point to transition maybe to what should we do about all this, given what we know and how little we do know about some of the more speculative or uncertain forecasting that you were talking about. what should policymakers be doing right now? And I'll just note that for this conversation, I know we're mostly focusing on things at like a very big picture, national level, federal policy, essentially, even though I'll acknowledge that there's a ton of activity on AI regulation of different types at the state and local level. That's where most policy that's actually explicitly related to AI has actually been considered or passed or not. But there are a lot of different agendas and frameworks and such being put forth in Congress right now. So what should we be doing about all of this? What should people be pushing for?
Yeah, I'd say the answer to that sort of depends on what angle of the rise of AI concerns you. And I'll just sketch out a couple and then maybe we can go into some detail on those. So the one angle is like there are some people who are just convinced that either it's clearly bad and or we are just unprepared for its implications. And so we want to throw sand in the gears of its implementation. If that's where you are, there are a couple things you could do on the policy front. If you're worried instead, it's a fragile base for current growth that could evaporate and lead to a recession in the near term. Then sort of just standard recession fighting measures should be on deck, being ready to expand unemployment insurance and make it more generous and pick up state share of Medicaid, for example. If you're worried instead that the next decade of AI implementation is going to be one where typical workers have a hard time in labor markets, getting the wage growth and steady employment they need to thrive, I'd say that's a super valid concern, but that the vast majority of policy changes that'll help workers are the big and broad changes that should have been made even before anyone was talking about AI. And finally, if you're utterly convinced that AI will lead to sort of mass joblessness and will replace human labor on an unprecedented scale, then that's another policy discussion that is mostly about making sure that wealth in the US, the thing besides work that can generate steady income for families, is far more equitably distributed going forward than it is today. So you really have to drill down on which angle of this you really want to make policy progress on to say what should be done.
So if I can take the liberty of like recapping a little, it's kind of like there's the a bucket of policy proposals that could be in this sand in the gears, like slow AI down, make, put a check on it, or the companies that make it more efficient, whatever. There's this sort of ensure good wages and jobs, regardless of what's going on with AI category. And then there's the sort of, if the really big picture, like inequality concern, essentially, and making sure that wealth is more fairly distributed. So let's take those maybe one at a time. Could you say a bit more about the sand in the gears? How do you put a check on these companies or think about slowing down some of these processes? I don't know, I'll start with Ben.
Yeah, so here I think there, like Josh said, there are kind of two possible ways forward. One is that you could introduce a token tax that imposed a small fee on every use of AI. One of the major concerns about AI, they're related to large language models that companies are providing for use, like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and so on. They take text as input and spit out some output. That input and output is measured by what are called tokens. And a token tax would be a federal tax charged to companies based on how many model tokens are used with their services. So it would be a usage-based tax applied at the point of sale. That tax would not be perfect. There would be ways to avoid it by using your own model instead of one of the frontier models from major companies. But it would reduce consumer and business demand for AI services by raising their price. And in the end, it probably wouldn't be the biggest revenue generator in the grand scheme of things, but if it were a large enough tax, it would certainly raise the price of AI tokens enough to slow down growth in that sector. The second kind of grains of sand route is something you see today in the fights that are playing out at the local level on data center construction. Localities are deciding if they like the jobs generated by constructing data centers or if they're worried about the stress on electrical and water infrastructure imposed by them. Some even think that fighting data centers in localities might slow overall AI adoption, and that's a reason to engage in those fights. I am not particularly optimistic about that just because of the competition between different localities for economic development. And frankly, the opportunity to rub elbows with some of the most powerful companies in the world, those things are going to cause some local leaders somewhere to give in. But if you had federal legislation that mandated that data center companies make a positive contribution to electrical or water processing capacity of any locality, that might both slow down development and also mitigate some of the potential harms in terms of utility use and capacity. Also, there are huge state and local tax incentives for convincing data centers and the like to locate in a particular area. We could, in principle, render all of those moot at the federal level by making those incentives taxable federal income. That would certainly slow things down and get rid of the harmful competition between localities. And instead, communities would compete on the attractiveness of their amenities and public services rather than competing on whoever was willing to give away the most in tax benefits.
Thanks for that, Ben. And maybe I'll turn to Josh perhaps for the next kind of bucket that you identified on jobs and wages. You know, what policy ideas should people be considering there if those are your main concerns about what happens to degrade the labor market?
Yeah, I think those, to return to a theme we've talked about, they should be broad. They should basically be policies that level the fundamental imbalance of power that afflict workers when they try to bargain for higher wages against employers who are using every tool at their disposal, including technology and AI, to disempower them. So basically, high minimum wages, labor law reform that protects the right to organize and bargain collectively, and really aggressive pursuit of sustained full employment, and measures to bolster our far too weak welfare state. I would say just one thing in particular. We've talked a lot in this sort of webinar about the importance of unions. It's not just to bolster the overall bargaining power of workers, even specifically to AI. Like, my real faith that workplace specific AI rules will be crafted will only come if there is actually an on the ground workplace institution, a union that is guiding it. I just don't have much faith that like policymakers in Washington, D.C. are going to be able to win the game of whack-a-mole with employers in terms of like, we're going to put guardrails on every conceivable way that AI might be used to degrade job quality. That's why just granting workers more power in every workplace, I think, is the way to sort of really ensure that AI rules are crafted in a way that's sort of appropriate for every workplace. Um, it's just one example on this. Like, one of the things people talk about a lot is, AI being able to amplify the ability of employers to do employee surveillance. I would say the main reason why employer surveillance is threatening to workers is because good jobs are scarce and the threat of being fired carries real weight, and workers are reluctant to just quit to escape unfair working conditions. If you had an economy that was characterized by really tight labor markets, where just workers were needed by employers all over the place, and you had widespread unionization that vastly increased the share of jobs in the economy that were good, then this threat of surveillance would be greatly ameliorated. Bad employers that engaged in terrible surveillance practices would just have a hard time holding on to workers, and this would discipline their behavior. And so, and to be clear, abusive employer surveillance has just been done for a long time. And so instead of coming up with AI specific guardrails, shouldn't we attack the root vulnerabilities of workers in capitalist labor markets that make surveillance so chilling for job quality and wage growth? And so I think the better approach on all this is to stay as broad as possible. And so I think that's the best way to ensure job quality in the era of AI.
And I'll just insert myself here to add a finer point on that. Unions, just by way of example, are actively bargaining over AI and tech provisions right now in their, have secured protections in their contracts, are fighting for them. There's a really great resource that maybe can include in our follow-up materials from our friends at the UC Berkeley Labor Center. They maintain kind of a database of sample contracts that are doing this. There are folks in all different types of sectors that are dealing with this now, folks in the kind of communication space, actors and artists and journalists, arguing over protections for their kind of IP, their voices, their likeness, their writing. There are folks who are pushing back on the use of automated surveillance, and not just AI related. You don't necessarily need to get to the point of AI for it, but algorithmic decision making, right? The right to have a manager who they can go to and demand an explanation for why they're being assigned a certain quota or why they're not, getting a certain promotion, that kind of thing. So I just want to call that out, that this is something that labor unions are actively participating in the context of their very specific workplaces and concerns in terms of implementation. So I think that's important to highlight on the very personal level too. Ben, I want to turn to you for a question about AI in the public sector. Are there things that policymakers should be thinking of there to head off some of the harms, that could come from implementation in that space?
Yeah, that is a very good question because, AI is being used as the ultimate excuse for a lot of things, and there is a real concern about AI being used as an excuse to basically further degrade state capacity in the public sector. The US public sector has been cut extensively in recent decades and very recently, and it's still an under-recognized story. Lots of the dysfunction that we associate with public services is not really a sign of a powerful bureaucracy that's unresponsive to the public. It's actually a very responsive civil service that's completely and utterly overwhelmed and understaffed. Policymakers who don't want an effective public sector are always looking to cut that further, and they will claim that AI can be used to easily substitute for civil servants. And that is almost always going to be wrong. The most egregious examples, of course, are the absolutely idiotic stories of the zealots and Doge who used AI to make decisions. And in short, they and their allies want the public sector to be ineffective. And the strategy of cutting workers and replacing them with AI is consistent with that. The main issue here is that by construction, the public sector doesn't really have a market test that can push away from the worst stupidities of AI adoption. In the private sector, if you have a company and they decide to use AI to substitute for workers to make more profits, if their service or the goods that they're providing suffer, they're likely to lose sales and realize the AI swap is not helping profitability. So they hire more workers and spend less on AI tools. Or they go out of business and other companies adopt a more successful strategy. But there's no profitability check on the public sector. Its hiring and its level of service is entirely driven by politics. Also, AI adoption that goes badly in the private sector, it has relatively small harms most of the time. Interactions with the public sector, however, often have much higher stakes. Like if your the AI that chooses Netflix recommendations goes wrong, there's not a lot of harm there. But if your state government unemployment insurance system that uses AI and incorrectly marks you as ineligible, or incorrectly marks you as being ineligible for receiving Medicaid or SNAP, or it doesn't allow you to enroll your kid in the local public school, all of that is much, much worse. Plenty of private sector abuses do cause real harm, of course, but everybody should be entitled to good public sector services across the board. The solution to fighting the solution to this is really fighting against the cuts to the public sector and actually expanding it, actually committing to improve public services with additional capacity rather than destroying that capacity. And this is a huge concern right now, given the recent cuts to our safety net and the possibility of a future recession. If a recession occurs in the coming years, it will hit just as our key safety net programs are getting shredded by the Republican tax and spending megabill that was passed in 2025. Whether a recession or massive job losses in the next 10 years is AI driven or not, it's going to be made much worse due to these cuts.
And lastly, on the kind of policy solution conversation, before I definitely want to try to turn to some of the many great questions we've had coming in. Let's say that the forecasting, as speculative as we understand it is wrong, and wide-scale normalization adoption of AI does lead to unprecedented job loss, devaluation of labor, kind of mass unemployment. What could or should we do to prepare for that outcome? Like what set of policy solutions would address that scenario?
Yeah, so I'll go pretty quick because I still think this is a very unlikely scenario, pretty radical scenario, but it would require a pretty radical policy change. I mean, basically, it's a scenario where the profit share of income in the US just rises enormously. Like right now, it's less than 10% of GDP, whereas labor compensation is over 50% of GDP. These sort of radical scenarios of mass displacement would kind of flip those things. I'd say the main problem with sort of capital income generally, like income generated by the ownership of assets, is it's very concentrated among the wealthy. The top 1% own about 40% of corporate stocks. If everyone in the economy owned the exact same amount of wealth, a big shift toward profits would be fine. It would boost every family's income. redistributing the ownership of wealth more broadly would be a great thing to do, AI or not. It's a real problem in the sort of status quo economy. There's a bunch of schemes to do this. I would say they all basically involve either a tax or a steady mandatory dilution of existing owners' shares in companies, with the taxes or newly created shares being distributed more broadly across the economy. There are real world examples that have approximated this. The Alaska Fund takes a share of income generated by mining and the sale of oil from the state, puts it into a fund that pays a dividend to every citizen. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is mostly financed by proceeds from its own oil and gas drilling, provides a big chunk of the state's revenues for a very extensive welfare state. Sweden in the 1970s proposed something that would have led to a much broader ownership of stocks. This could all happen. I think the mechanics of it are not very hard to imagine. The politics of it are incredibly hard to imagine in a US economy and politics that are just controlled by people who currently own all that wealth. I would say the general model of like capital taxation funding broad-based income payments to deal with this world, you could calibrate it to have it start very modest and then automatically ramp up if these sort of more radical scenarios happened. The Nobel Prize winner Robert Shiller once proposed annual changes to income tax parameters that would leave post-tax inequality unchanged. So if something happened in the market and the top 1% saw a huge gain in their market income, the income tax system would automatically adjust to redistribute that income. You could do something similar. It really sounds speculative and hard to accomplish in our politics for sure. But if you think the sort of scale of displacement coming from AI is that terrifying, then that is the solution to it. Something really big and radical, like a very big redistribution of wealth in the US economy.
That's very helpful to hear. And I think maybe building off of that, I'll start jumping maybe to some of the questions because I had one kind of summation, one that sort of builds off the policy discussion. Could you share a little bit what you think of if your greatest concerns are on perhaps exposure, say, right? Like if you're someone, a worker out there or someone advocating for workers' rights on AI in the workplace, you might be concerned for sure about displacement, even if not mass unemployment. What about also the issue of AI exposure on your job? For instance, people having tools or software pushed on them that they don't want to use, or how the use of the system on the job may make their jobs less safe, less enjoyable, harder to do, that kind of thing. Is there anything you want to speak to there in terms of that sort of like job quality degradation versus the job loss? And I think you mentioned this in terms of some of the labor standards, but anything you want to share on your thoughts on the scale of that?
I can add a few things. So that's a great question. Honestly, the biggest solution to a lot of those things is actually having a functional labor law where workers can organize and represent themselves at the workplace and make sure that they are compensated for the difficult work that they endure, and also do so in a safe way. I think, it's that the one reason I really like that question is that I think it starts to get at the actual harms of decisions being made rather than just like focusing on AI kind of generally. And so one is making sure that, the harm here is that workers don't have enough of a voice at their workplace. Well, unions are the way forward on that. The second kind of harm is that it's an unsafe workplace, or that, working conditions are too strenuous. Well, we in principle have a solution for that. It's definitely been hampered in recent years and in recent decades. But that just means, actually making sure that OSHA has good regulations and that OSHA is empowered to inspect and compel employers to maintain a safe workplace.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And just to highlight, the last thing you said about enforcement, like giving workers more rights on the job, even specific to AI, without empowering them to know their rights or providing like a public agent, the investigators, the the litigators, et cetera, who enforce those rights. It's not going to help anyone probably if we pass more AI specific anti-discrimination provisions, but the EEOC is still totally captured and is facing budget cuts and is gutted by the Trump administration and that kind of thing. So I think that's really important to note. I think, there were a few questions that came in kind of about there's just a lot of federal inaction on this, right? Like, does anyone really think that Congress, for instance, is going to be able to pass like a reasonable standard that gets at some of these concerns? Shouldn't state and local governments step in and take some action there? And I'll let you all answer, but I also want to get to the issue of preemption. So if Josh or Ben, if you want to weigh in on that, go for it.
I mean, I'll just say quickly, because I think preemption is the big issue. So I'm going to kick it back to you in one sec. To the degree the federal government is not providing sort of the leadership people want on this issue, absolutely the option for states to move forward should totally be preserved.
And I'll just add on that if, for folks who are watching Congress and following, there have been attempts all through last year and continuing into this year by kind of pro AI members of Congress to preempt states from doing their own further regulation, states and localities on AI. And some of these have been more targeted to specific things. One that, when Republican senator was trying to get in the reconciliation bill last year was totally sweeping. It just would have said anything on AI, even like state regulations on deep fakes. So we're not even talking about things, designed to protect children. So we're not even talking about things necessarily related to the economy. But I think the preemption fight is definitely worth keeping an eye on if you are working at all on state or local advocacy around these issues. We have one more minute, so I'm maybe going to go to one other question about barriers to organizing unions. Do you want to talk a little more about what could be done to strengthen worker voice and make sure that workers have a protection, have some say or protections over how AI might be implemented in their workplace?
Go ahead, Josh.
Okay. Basically gonna sort of repeat the story that I think the biggest barrier to workers who want to organize a union today has very little to do with technological barriers, and it has all to do with legal and policy barriers. And so if you want the law, we want the law to protect workers who want to organize from retaliation or firing by employers. That requires things like the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, along with other related legislation. That's the absolutely necessary condition. And if those legal and institutional reforms passed, I don't think technology would be a big barrier. In fact, in a better institutional environment, those technological tools might actually help union organizing.
I think that's an excellent final word to end on. I know we're just a minute past time, but thank you all for spending so much time with us, for submitting your questions, and we look forward to following up with you in the future.